smart people told you so. And you trust them when it's their area of expertise and enough of them agree. Of course authority matters. That doesn't mean it's infallible, just ask Galileo. But it's certainly a better bet than armchair analysis. So who is providing the rebuttal to the AAAS, NAS, and USCAP statements that seem like such a slam dunk? I'll share a handful of names, and if you keep your eyes out, I guarantee you'll recognize them in the future, because they come up again and again. They're almost all professional individuals. In fact, most of them are scientists. Remember, there are a lot of people out there to cherry pick from, and remember where they fall on our credibility spectrum. Maybe this is the origin of the objection I sometimes hear. It is true that the climate is changing, but there's a lot of debate about whether we're the ones causing it. Hopefully you see now, from the AAAS and NAS statements, that no, there really isn't debate about the cause of climate change, at least not in the scientific community, who really are the only people actually qualified to debate the evidence. And these scientists who are climate skeptics, you'll hear them complain that they've been marginalized because they spoke out against the orthodoxy. No, they've been marginalized because they no longer have any credibility with the other scientists. No one will even debate them because they've gotten so far out there. Incidentally, that'll be a claim you hear too. The chickens won't even debate me because they know I'm right. So you will see quotes from guys with scientific-sounding titles after their names, giving reasons that human-caused climate change is bunk. They can be found. The Google is a wonderful thing. But just because someone on the web can provide quote after quote doesn't make the case very convincing. Volume doesn't count for very much when you're way down here on the credibility spectrum. The only category less credible than these guys is some random jerk on YouTube. Wait. Speaking of us jerks on YouTube, Speaking of YouTube, I've had a bunch of people send me links to at least 3 separate documentaries on YouTube proving human-caused global warming to be false. Now, if someone sends you such references, you have 2 choices. You can either look up the criticisms of those movies, being sure to evaluate the credibility of those providing the criticisms using our credibility spectrum, or you can save time and short-circuit the whole debate by simply asking the person who sent you the links, what is your explanation for why these filmmakers would be more correct about the science than AAAS and NAS? If they fall back on, well, the scientists have a vested interest in people listening to them because it keeps the grant money coming, so they're biased, try applying that standard to the filmmakers. Filmmakers versus scientists, for Pete's sake. Is it really reasonable to think that scientists' paychecks are more vulnerable to the public's taste than filmmakers? Make up your own mind, but like I said in How It All Ends, it sure seems to me like the reasons are overwhelming to believe that this row has a much greater probability than this one, pushing this line up. Now remember, we're trying to get a sense of which column is our best bet by using the tool of expected value, which has 2 components: probability, which is what we've just been establishing, and consequence. Let's talk about consequences now. And with this, it'll be a little confusing here, because in my earlier example with the gaming about expected value, the consequence was a payoff from the bank, and therefore a positive thing that we wanted to maximize. Here, the consequence is going to be the negative impacts of our actions, which we want to minimize. So once we get our expected value, we'll want to pick the column with the lower expected value because it will give a sense of the pain and suffering we can expect from choosing that column. Another complexity is going to be that, unlike with our gaming example earlier, we don't know what the consequences in the box will be. That in itself has a lot of uncertainties. In fact, in a long back and forth with one skeptic, as I was trying to find a credible source for the possible economic consequences in the upper left-hand corner, he finally got exasperated and said, economic models are even less reliable than climate models. Which I thought was kind of funny, because skeptics are usually all over climate models like a bad rash. So when you hear skeptics warning that we shouldn't take action because it might hurt the economy, ask yourself, or ask them if you're feeling up to it, where's the acknowledgement of uncertainty up here? That is the hallmark of the careful, methodical scientist down here. Anthropogenic global warming is uncertain and might not be true, so we shouldn't take action yet until we know. Why not take action just in case? Better safe than sorry. Because it would hurt the economy. Did you catch the Jedi mind trick? Does it seem fair to you to claim that economic harm will definitely happen, and yet claim that this is only a possibility? That this is uncertain, but this is certain? Maybe this hypocrisy of implying certainty for their side while attacking the uncertainty of the other side will count for something when you evaluate these arguments for yourself in the future. After all, where's the wisdom in ignoring the warnings from the more reliable model of climate change in favor of heeding the warnings of the weaker model of economics? Anyway, to simplify our expected value estimation, let's neglect putting in the proper range of consequences in each box, and instead just take the feasible worst case scenario, because that's what we really care about, right? What's the worst that could happen? That gives us a single value for a consequence in a box that we can then multiply by the probability of that row to get the column's expected value. Let's start with the upper left box here, where we took action, but we didn't need to because human-caused climate change turned out not to be true after all. This is the consequence that the skeptics warn us about. When I first did this grid in the most terrifying video, I put in worldwide depression up here. But get this, I just pulled that out of my hat. I totally made it up because I was trying to show extremes. Well, people got hung up on it, so this time I decided to try to get some reliable sources instead of just blowing smoke. I did a bunch of searching because I wanted to find some really credible stuff, maybe a professional association of economists like AAAS or NAS is for science, but from the other side of the debate. I wasn't finding much that wasn't on the bottom of the credibility spectrum, so I challenged climate skeptics to find good sources predicting dire economic consequences up here for me. I put the challenge in the comments to my most terrifying video. I was even deliberately brash, trying to provoke response. Felt kind of naughty. I had a long back and forth with the quite thoughtful, educated guy who referred to his long first response as the thinking man's objection to anthropogenic global warming, a description I found a little odd. I emailed the big conservative think tanks, Cato, CEI, AEI, Heritage. I asked for help in some climate skeptic discussion groups. I even emailed Professor Ross McKittrick himself, one of the most prestigious skeptics, who is a professor of economics at the University of Guelph in Canada. I figured if he didn't know, nobody did. And he did send me several documents. The reason I went to such great lengths was I wanted to avoid the confirmation bias described in the video Nature of Science by trying to find evidence to disprove my views. I hope you'll agree that I at least did a conscientious job of looking. Well, if you're a skeptic, don't get your hopes up, because with all of that searching, I still couldn't find any credible economic disaster scenarios for this box. Credible meaning from sources above conservative think tanks or professional individuals on the credibility spectrum. To be honest, I didn't even try to find anything from those sources because I knew I wouldn't put much stock in it. Maybe economic disaster scenarios resulting from unnecessary action on climate change don't even exist above the individual layperson, the blogger, which would really say something, wouldn't it? Anyway, the most dire stuff I could find that was credible entailed a reduction of GDP growth with a maximum estimate of 3% up here. Now keep in mind, that's a reduction in GDP growth. 3% reduction. Anyway, the most dire stuff I could find that was credible entailed a reduction in GDP growth with a maximum estimate of 3%. Now keep in mind that's not a reduction in GDP, that's a reduction in GDP growth, meaning it's not growing as fast as it otherwise would have. There's a ton more econometric numbers in there, but I couldn't find any sort of concrete description of the fallout of that, like a depression. And that 3% was on the outside of the predictions. Most credible sources put it closer to 1.5 to 2% reduction in GDP growth. Certainly no mention of a depression, even in the US, even in just the US, much less the globe. If you'd like to look at the documents Professor McKittrick sent me, I've made them available online. Perhaps they're more dire than I could make out. I put them on Google Docs and I'll provide the URLs for you at the end of this video. Sorry for the formatting disaster. I received them as PDFs, which Google Docs turns out doesn't accept, so I did what I could to make them available. I'm sure there's plenty of you out there that are smarter than me. Let me know what you figure out from those documents. So, no depression up here. Just some wasted economic resources that could have gone for something else, but no global depression giving rise to the next Hitler or nuclear war. Now, I don't want to trivialize the economic cost. I've been laid off before because of a recession. It sucks. But compared to what happens down here in the lower right corner, well, we'll get to that. The other source a bunch of people pointed me to was a project called the Copenhagen Consensus, headed by economist Bjorn Lomborg, author of The Skeptical Environmentalist. It was an interesting project where 8 economists, 4 of them Nobel Prize winners, got together and asked the question, faced with all of the world's problems, if we had $50 billion over the next 4 years to spend to do good in this world, where should we spend it? They ended up putting climate change on the bottom of their list for some interesting reasons, which I won't debate here for 2 reasons. First, it doesn't help us with our grid because it doesn't answer the question, what is the feasible worst-case scenario for harm if we take action on climate change and it turned out to be unnecessary or ineffective? And the second reason is because if you Google the words economist statement climate change,